Thanks so much for that introduction, Josh. And it's great to be working again together after a few years, both migrating out to BC. So I appreciate the invitation to be able to talk today a little bit about grief and bereavement and some of the unique needs in the 2SLGBTQ plus community. So we can go to the next slide, I think, at this point. Just a few very simple learning objectives. This is meant to be a very brief overview so that we can increase awareness of what does grief and loss look like specifically for our community? How is it similar? How might it be different? So to highlight some of those unique needs, and also to talk a little bit about what organizations can do to help empower and welcome 2SLGBTQ plus clients who are seeking out bereavement and loss support. Also, we'll take a look at some of the barriers, things that may make it more difficult, and to give some tips on how to create that safe space. So I'm going to walk you through a very brief slideshow here, and then I'll turn it over to Mike, who will share his personal experience. I also want to say that, of course, grief is a unique experience for each of us, and not trying in any way to categorize or say that everyone who fits in to the 2SLGBTQ plus community is grieving the same. Of course, there's tremendous variability. I'm by no means an expert, and I'm conscious of the fact that there's a great deal of expertise here today, and definitely welcome all of your input, questions, and comments. And we can go ahead. So sometimes, some of the letters and symbols can be a bit confusing. So I thought that it might just be a good idea to do a brief overview of what some of these mean. And if I've missed anything, feel free to jump in and correct me. I think, so 2S, I feel like sometimes gets a little bit lost when we're talking about this community. And 2S is really stands for Two-Spirit Indigenous. And my understanding is that throughout Indigenous culture, the two-spirited people embodied both the male and female spirit. So it was a way of walking in balance through the world, offering a very unique insight. It was a gift, really. And so two-spirited individuals can sometimes be forgotten in conversations in terms of the LGBTQ community, or maybe misunderstood. But we want to acknowledge the impact of colonization and generational trauma for this group, once held in a very respected place in society, and there was an acceptance and an understanding of their gender identity. And now sometimes not always, there may be a lack of support there. So I think it's important to talk about that. LGBT, probably people are more familiar with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. T for transgender really means that the gender identity differs from the one assigned at birth. So the sense of who you are as an individual, we would describe as gender identity. Q stands for queer. This could mean questioning, people who are questioning their identity, their orientation. It can also be kind of an umbrella term for the whole 2SLGBTQ plus community. And I might be referring sometimes to the community today by saying queer, just because it's easier to say. And then plus, anything that might fall out of outside of these terms. And next slide. So Norman Cousins has written a lot about health and well-being and illness. And I like what he says: death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside us while we live. So for those of us who grew up in a heteronormative society, we knew that we were different at a very young age. And many of us tried to hide ourselves because we felt that we weren't okay the way we were. And I think there's a really good description of this by Alan Downs in his book, The Velvet Rage. And this idea of the public self versus the private self. And so we learned, according to Downs, that we were unacceptable as we were. What can happen sometimes is a masking of the real self, the authentic self, to fit into society with those around us. And so it begs the question, how does that impact us over the lifespan? How does that masking, that split, impact us, particularly when we're grieving? And so I think when we're all working with the queer community, we need to be aware that the existence of trauma is there for many of us who grew up without support, who may have gone through bullying and trauma in our young lives and our adult lives. So there may be many losses that have been experienced throughout the lifespan. Of course, the generations are very different here. Some of the older generations, the traditionalists, the boomers, maybe even Gen X, lived through a more repressive time, and so experienced perhaps more trauma and loss. We had the HIV and AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and onward. Canadian civil servants, actually, in Canada, it's hard to believe that as recently as the 1990s, if they were found out who they were in terms of being gay or bisexual, they could be fired, they could be persecuted for their sexuality, many lives were ruined. And it's amazing to me that in Canada, only just 30 years ago, that was the case. So even in our country now, that we think of being very progressive and very protective, it wasn't that long ago that it was a real problem if you were out and you were different, if you were gay, if you were bisexual, certainly if you were trans. This led to a historic apology. I don't know if any of you remember this back in, I think it was 2017, apology from Trudeau apologizing for the way people were treated. And I think there was upwards of $100 million for compensation for civil servants whose careers were sidelined because of who they were. So not that long ago. So again, we're talking trauma, we're talking fear in our community. You really have an idea of just a very brief sketch of some of the issues there. Add that to today, what's happening in the US, or maybe even a little bit in Canada. There's this rejection of the understanding about a gender fluid identity. So there's been great gains that have been made, but there's also fear that that we're going backwards at the moment. And we see that in Alberta as well, in Canada, in terms of some of the issues around transgendered youth. So I think all that to say, when we're working with someone who's grieving and who is going through a grief experience, it's important to be aware of some of this background information that may or may not have affected that individual in their bereavement. And the next slide. Okay, I like this quote. All of us are put into boxes by our family, by our religion, by our society, our moment in history, even our own bodies. Some people have the courage to break free. I'd be curious to know later on if you have any comments about that or what you think about it. So what does that look like? What does it look like to break free? What does the quest towards authenticity look like for those of us who are outside the norm? Those of us who choose the road less traveled, so to speak. And next slide. So I don't know if any of you might be familiar with Megan Devine's work. She's written a great book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And I think it's relevant when we're talking about, certainly about grief, but also the journey towards self-acceptance. So grief is the response, a natural, normal response. And those of you who are grief and loss counselors, you know that we do a lot of education with our clients about what's normal, because people often come in and they think, okay, I'm losing it. I can't remember where I'm putting my keys. I'm emotional. There's this tsunami of grief that's hitting me at unexpected times. I can't focus. I can't work. So a lot of what we do is to say, yeah, you're not going to be yourself. It's okay that you're not okay. And, well-meaning advice from others, friends, maybe even sometimes professionals, might make it more difficult for people who are grieving, according to Devine, and certainly according to my own experience. Our culture tends to treat grief like it's a problem, it's an illness. How can we get over this? So what we're often wanting to do is to help people acknowledge where they're at, to lean into the experience of grief, which, it's often not something that we really want to do, is it? Because it's uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. And so sometimes we need help to do that. Sometimes the help is just an acknowledgement that we're going through a very difficult, life-changing time. And for people who are queer, probably been a lifetime of this, feeling like we're not okay. How do I fit in? So again, if we kind of draw the parallel there to grief and bereavement, that may make it even more difficult in the process. Next slide. So grief, we could talk for a long time about grief. There's many different theories and approaches to grief. I always say grief is as unique as your thumbprint. Nobody will experience grief in the same way that you will. And there's a million different theories and approaches to grief too. No one right or wrong. Grief is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. It's certainly not a linear process. We've come a long way from the 60s and 70s when we thought of the 5 stages of grief and that everyone has to go through those stages. We know now that it's a much more variable process than that. Grief, of course, impacts us on all levels of our being. So we often think of it as just an emotional response, that it certainly is, but we sometimes forget that grief and our experience of grief impacts us physically. We often feel it in our physical being. It impacts us mentally or cognitively in terms of not being able to think clearly, not being able to focus, being more forgetful. I don't know what all of you, what your experience is, but I find that that's the one that's often the biggest surprise to people, that they don't necessarily make the connection between grief and these cognitive changes that they see in themselves. Passive choiceless just means that we can't necessarily control those reactions that we're going to have, and they're often quite surprising and quite uncomfortable. So you can be in the grocery store thinking you're doing okay, and you're getting your groceries, you're coping, and suddenly you hear a song or you run into someone and the tsunami, the floodgates open, and that can be very difficult to cope with. So for people in the queer community that are grieving, we may be experiencing already a sense of being disenfranchised and marginalized, partly because we may not have the traditional family support that other people have. Perhaps our families aren't very understanding of who we are and our choices in life in terms of our partner, but they may not be. We may not have parents who are on board with that. And so the move away from family can mean that perhaps we're even more alone in our grief. And we know how important social support can be. Next slide. So this individual writes, I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was a sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being. That word acceptance, I think, is very hard for many of us in the grieving process. It's hard to accept the fact that that person that you love so much is no longer physically in your life. So as all of you know, we often say grief has no timetable. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. The goal is really to grieve well, whatever that might mean for you. And grief changes over time. And we change over time. And next slide. Gotta love Rumi. I love him anyway. Ancient Sufi mystic who's written a lot about how to deal with life events. And he says, once you accept the troubles you've been given, the door opens. So what do you suppose he means by that? I guess the power of acceptance, the power of being able to lean into who we are, our authentic selves. And there is a tremendous power in that, no matter who you are. And also the moment that we can begin to accept our feelings and where we're at in the grief process. And next slide. Okay, so grief response is a little bit more active. It's how we respond to some of the world and ourselves as we're going through grief, how we adapt and come to terms with the loss. So David Kessler wrote a book that helped me in the aftermath of my mother's death. And he was the guy who did a lot of work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, coming up with, I always forget if it's 5 or 6 stages of grief, but the stages of grief. But he wrote another book called the 6th stage of grief, finding meaning and purpose in your world after the death of a loved one. So there's a sense in grief about what have I lost, but it's also about who am I becoming? So we often talk about grief recovery. I don't know that I love the word recovery because it sort of implies a return to the way you were before. And I don't know if we ever completely go back. We regain a sense of ourselves and balance, but we find kind of a new way of being in the world. So that book was helpful to me after my mom died a few years back, at the ripe old age of 99, and I had been her caregiver for many, many years. It was in a way a relief when she died because she was ready to go. But there was this huge void in terms of, I don't know what my purpose is. My purpose is taking care of mom and advocating at the long-term care home for the help that she needed. And, just my focus every day, although I continued to work. But after she died, it was like, I'm kind of lost here because I'm not sure what my purpose is anymore. So part of our work in grief counseling and therapy is to help individuals find that renewed purpose in life. And it may take a while to get there, and it may be very cloudy and very fuzzy. But I think being able to have the courage to be in that liminal space, as it's often called, the kind of in-between process, may be really, really helpful for people. So action engagement with our grief. So, there's lots of choice there. It may be a choice to find someone to express our grief with. Much of grief is also private. Some people choose not to do that. It might be reaching out for bereavement supports in your community, if there are any. And then that, again, kind of going back to the lens of 2SLGBTQ+, perhaps more challenging for us because there may not be a group or a connection in your community that you feel comfortable with. So you may not want to go to a heteronormative group. You probably might want to talk to a counselor who is understanding and who's an ally. Certainly with the advent now of virtual help, you can choose, hopefully, a counselor anywhere. It doesn't have to necessarily be in your small community. And next slide. I like Dr. Lucy Hone. Josh and I heard her speak last fall, and she talks a lot about how can we be resilient in grieving. So not everybody's cup of tea, but I like it. She's written a book called Resilient Grieving. So she kind of comes from the point of view of saying, okay, this really awful thing, life-changing event happened, but I don't want my life to be over. How can I actively cope in the face of a devastating loss? So she has a couple of really brief points. And she says the first one is just to understand that suffering and loss are a part of life. So I think there she's kind of talking about our mindset, our beliefs around that. And so there's kind of where that acceptance part comes in. Again, not meaning to minimize it or to say that that's easy, but understanding that we're all mortal. She talks a lot about you can choose where to place your focus so that we have, it may not seem like a choice, but that we have a choice what we want to focus on. So that could look like a lot of different things. It could be a choice to acknowledge the feelings that you have around grief. She would also say, and curious what all of you think on this, because there's no one right or wrong, but she would say it's important to also acknowledge feelings of gratitude. Look for the gratitude in your everyday. Pretty tough to do, I think. Again, tell me what you think. Pretty tough to do when you're grieving, because often we feel like there's nothing to be grateful for. She would challenge us and say, see if you can find something that you're grateful for, even in the midst of loss. She has a question that she says we should be asking throughout the process. Is this helping or is this harming me? So because it's a time of feeling a little bit lost and confused, and so we might be trying different things. So she would say, just reflect and say, is this behavior helping or harming me? There can be, of course, a tendency to want to escape from these really uncomfortable feelings of grief. Sometimes that might involve addictive behaviors. So that might be one example. And she, again, like most theories of grief support, talks about the importance of social support. Might be joining a community group or going for counseling, but it might just be surrounding yourself with people who are there really just to listen to you and who care about you. And next slide. Okay, so when we talk about the queer community, what does resilience look like? And resilience, different definitions could be defined as skills and abilities learned and developed because of adversarial experiences of prejudice and discrimination. So for many of us, we are searching for family. We're searching for support because we may not have had it growing up. So often we find it's often referred to as the chosen family. So we choose the people in our life to love and to be close to and to celebrate birthdays and Thanksgivings with, people who are there for us and we're there for them. So that may not have been there in the traditional way for us, but we can build it. We can choose that. And I think many people can relate to that. So the importance of community connectedness, and of course, self-acceptance. So core beliefs about who we are, finding a renewed purpose, perhaps going through difficulties can increase our compassion and open our heart to helping others that are going through something similar. Next support. Next slide, rather. Okay, so what are some barriers to support for a queer individual who is looking for grief and bereavement support in their community? Some interesting statistics that I found when researching this, that isolation is significantly greater for 2SLGBTQ plus seniors than in the non-queer seniors community. So again, looking at that generational difference, because perhaps living through a more repressive time, not having that family or healthcare support. Interesting, 48% of queer and trans seniors had not told their primary care provider about their sexual or gender identity, so almost half. So that's quite interesting, that these people are perhaps not feeling able or safe to do that. There's a barrier because if your primary health care provider doesn't know who you are, they can't necessarily talk to you and refer you to appropriate supports in the community. Certainly, in many communities, I would say across our country, there's a lack of supports specifically for bereavement for queer individuals. So often we're intaking into groups that already exist, but they're not necessarily queer specific or even queer friendly. Groups may not be particularly welcoming or understanding. So there's often a fear and a hesitancy, a reluctance to reach out and to go to that group. I was chatting with a friend recently whose husband died, and we were talking about some bereavement supports in his community, and I mentioned that the grief walk, there's often grief walks that happen in addition to the grief circles, and I had suggested that to him, and he said, I don't know if I want to go and walk with older women who have lost their spouse. He said, I just don't know about that. So we had a discussion that they could be very welcoming, they might not, what would that be like? But he, when you're grieving, you're in a pretty vulnerable space, and taking that extra leap of faith to try a group might be difficult. There's that fear of judgment from others that many of us have experienced our whole lives. And next slide. So how can we foster a sense of acceptance, comfort, and belonging for queer individuals who are coming to us for support? Some basic ideas here, and also interested in hearing some others that you may know about as well. But I think one thing we can do is just to ask people about their preferred pronouns. So our use of language can be really important in promoting safety and belonging. So we don't assume ever heterosexuality or even gender. So in terms of intake forms, rather than asking someone about their name, their legal name, that might be important, but it could also be important to say, what is the name that you go by? How do you want to be addressed? Organizations can also promote, 2SLGBTQ plus symbols on their website, so that people who are researching, is this a space that I might want to come to, perhaps they see a pride flag, perhaps putting a non-discrimination policy, a welcoming policy in a very public space that people can see. So as an agency, as an organization, what is your mission? What are your values? And how do you express those values of inclusion? So really, again and again and again, letting clients and letting the community know that you are a queer-friendly, welcoming space, that we do not tolerate prejudice or discrimination. All these things can really help that person who's wondering about coming for support, can help them to make that decision. There's a great organization here in Vancouver called Dignity Seniors Support, and they actually go in and work with employers in the workplace and do training. So, some of the stuff we've talked about today, but much more in depth, to say, how can you become a queer-friendly, welcoming organization? You might also, if there was a need, you might look at establishing in-house supports for queer people, one-on-one groups, perhaps. And I don't know if anyone has tried that. I'm interested to find out. And next slide. So we never know what love is going to look like. We don't know what grief is going to look like, and we shouldn't make assumptions. I just came across this quotation from Liza Minnelli, who's been a great champion of gay and queer rights over the years. She just said this recently. I learned that different meant many things: freedom, oppression, celebration, sadness, responsibility, hiding, protesting, sharing, but most of all, being true to oneself, no matter the price. So how do we find the courage in our world, particularly when we're grieving, to be true to who we are? I think sometimes we need support. And next slide. So again, just kind of, again, that kind of mentoring and mirroring. So in an organization, adding pronouns after your name, even if you're not part of the community. So he, him, she, her, they, them, can be very helpful. Next slide. Imagine creating an organization where people feel psychologically safe, where residents, staff, and volunteers don't have to leave their real selves at home. Moral stress is reduced, authenticity is encouraged, which in turn increases health outcomes and retention of staff and clients. And that is, again, from the wonderful organization Dignity Seniors Society in Vancouver. So really, isn't that the goal? That we want people, we want everyone to feel safe, and we want everyone to know that there's a place for them at the table. And next slide. So then when we have that support, we can also experience the joy and the celebration of being who we truly are, and knowing that it's safe to do that. And I think the last slide. So again, curious to hear what support might be for the community where you live. We're in Vancouver. I'd say we're pretty lucky. We're pretty fortunate to have some pretty robust organizations and outreach program. Health Initiative for Men, which is actually not just Vancouver, it's based province wide. A lot of amazing programs and services to strengthen the well-being of gay, bisexual, and queer men and gender diverse people. We have community, queer, trans, two-spirit folks looking for a sense of community, a lot of great youth programs, and also a specific program for seniors. And like Dignity, they will go into workplaces to help educate. And then Dignity Senior Society, amazing, partly because they do a lot of work with employers. So there's a lot of collaborating, a lot of education. And, you know, spiritual communities I thought was important to mention, because for many of us, we might have experienced a sense of rejection from our spiritual community. In Vancouver, a couple of really great locations, large churches, United and Anglican, who really have a very welcoming presence. St. Andrew's Wesley United Church is one of them. They start off every single service by saying, whoever you are, whoever you love, all of you is welcome here. So really making it clear continually that they support 2SLGBTQ plus people and their families. And I think that that's really important, to constantly be acknowledging that and saying it. So I feel like I talked a lot, and that's it. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's here, who is going to talk about his own unique experience of grief and bereavement.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just getting over a cold, so just bear with me. So, today I'm going to be speaking from my recent lived experience, um, as I lost my mother unexpectedly just 6 months ago. Um, and I just want to share some of the challenges and some of the things that I've learned through the early stages of my grief, because I think it's still early after 6 months. So, my mother wasn't just a mother. She was the loudest cheerleader in every chapter of my life. When I came out, she looked at me the only way any mother would, and she said, I hope you would have told me sooner so that you didn't go through this alone, and I'll always love you no matter what. So when I got that phone call that day that she was gone, it was like a tidal wave hit me. There was a shock that left me frozen. I was unable to process the loss, and I felt like someone had turned off the microphone in me mid-sentence. I lost that one person who amplified my voice. And here's the hardest part. When the biggest supporter is gone, you're left asking, where do I go? To be fully seen. Who's going to remind me that I'm enough on the days when the world still says I'm not? Losing a mother is universal, but losing a mother who shields your queerness makes the silence afterwards feel twice as loud. So early on, when I first lost mom, and I got a brother and just one brother. We're twins actually, and my dad. Um, I started trying to understand while I felt like I was grieving. I thought I should have been crying a lot, and I should have been mourning the loss. I felt abnormal in the sense of how I was responding to my mom's grief. And when I returned, I'm from Newfoundland originally, currently living in Ontario. When I returned, I had reached out after a few days to set up a grief counseling appointment with my with a counselor that I have been seeing regularly for many other reasons. And I felt numb, um, and just wasn't feel like I was n normal in that process. And the question was asked by my counselor after a couple of sessions, does being gay affect your grief? And I thought to myself, well, initially I thought that was an odd thing to ask. I never really thought of that. But then it was like a light bulb went off. And what I said was, well, yes, it does, because for me, growing up in a small town where there wasn't no exposure as a gay male, in a town of actually 600 people. I didn't have a lot of exposure growing up. So I would grieve every day when I was the age of 13, developing emotions. I can remember going to bed grieving, saying, you know, why can't I be attracted to a woman like my straight friends? I can remember going to bed praying that I would wake up and be straight. Or, well, if I'm a man and I like, man, why wasn't I born a woman? And I grieved from the age of 12, 13 until I came out when I was around 20. And I did that in silence. And grieving in silence, that's what's been normal for me. It wasn't grieving and crying and sobbing around those that I was most comfortable with, and that being mom. But I was puzzled and confused, and it started making sense. And there was a book that I read that was recommended by my therapist a couple of years ago called The Velvet Rage. I don't know if anyone's familiar with The Velvet Rage, but it's a phenomenal book. Um, and in that book, it says by a psychologist, Alan Downs, um, every night I mourned the straight life that I thought I was supposed to live. That years a seeker of unsupported grieving is what that psychologist said, and it named it the silent shame. Down writes that with authenticity is punished, and we learn to protect ourselves by numbing or redirecting feelings often into anger. So when mom died, my muscle memory was to flip the switch, feel nothing, stay safe, but I found myself getting angry again, and I haven't been angry in years. I know angry is a part of grief, but when you work so hard not to be angry with your other challenges as a homosexual, to understand the dynamics of the society and boxes that our society tries to make us fit in, um, I had to start reminding myself of that book and work through counseling to navigate um, some of those hurdles that I was now experiencing that I didn't think was going to affect me in the ways that they did. So that's why for queer people, bereavement support should include unlearning the early lessons of silent suffering. I think that's something that I learned through counseling is that I don't need to silence alone and isolate it. Um, some of the challenge I found were during the grievance process and still grieving is something that I thought of was straight pairs often have multiple family members who affirm with their identity, whereas many gay men primarily have their mom, and her absence can reopen those wounds of self-doubt. So even though I have a connection with my biological family, my mom was the only one whose love felt completely unconditional to me. While I have a close connection with my dad and a rocky relationship with my brother, Um, mom was my rock. So she naturally was my safety net. But since her passing, I've realized, and Geoff mentioned it early on in his or throughout his um, presentation, was our circle that we create outside of our family of queer friends and fair straight allies who cheer the loudest for you, and that's your biggest supporter, and understand your lived experiences better. So losing mom has only underlined how powerfully those friends now become family, and because they're the ones now holding the space that she once filled. So intersecting some of the pressures that I found was when mom's death was so sudden, um, it ended up being me planning the funeral, writing the obituary, doing her tribute. My dad chose a church who was known for preaching against, I don't want to say against, but when I grew up there, they weren't acceptance of LGBT individuals. And that was hard for me, but I had to respect it because we didn't expect her to die. And when I met with the pastor, I had to tell him that I have a husband and I have two young children and that this is our family because I wanted our family to be welcome in this space. I didn't want to feel unsafe. We need a service that honors my mom, but also respects us. And it was awkward that even in 2024, I had to advocate on this matter to the pastor, which I will acknowledge he was compassionate, but I was still uncertain. What was it going to like? Was I going to feel welcome? We still kept our grief PG, like we didn't really hold hands, we didn't lean on each other. And I don't because I don't want those unwanted stares still today, even though I'm very comfortable with who I am and that this is a safe place here today. Um, it's still hard to express in the most hardest times with your loved one. And I just want to make people aware that sometimes, even though we're the most comfortable individuals we are, sometimes putting ourselves in such a vulnerable situation exposes us to unwanted, unsolicited comments, remarks, or stares. So I was still going through that even as I was planning my mom's funeral and at the church. And we always measure safety first as a result. Queers mourn often have to advocate in their rawest moments, so faithful leaders in funeral homes must create explicit assurances on inclusion so we can grieve freely. What I found after my mom died, I tried to stick I don't want to get into too much of the dynamics with my brother, but I was trying to fulfill her role, have a healthier relationship with him, and while things were going good and I would advocate and encourage him on their new business, I was harshly put down by him. And I had to start putting barriers up for me and focus on my mental health and my family. Um, and take a step back and realize that, well, initially I felt I needed to always forgive my brother, especially now that my mom had passed and we're now only a family of three. But if he was going to treat me disrespectfully and say inappropriate remarks, especially given this political climate, um, it hurt me that I had to pull away, and it's been weeks since we spoke, given how early her passing was. But I had to do what not only protected me but my family, but it's also things that are triggering and almost like microaggressions in a form as a gay male. So you don't really know what people may be walking through. And to that being said, also now that my mom was gone and my dad was living home alone, he was so focused on his own individual grief. And it wasn't until I spoke to my aunt that she said when their dad died and when they lost their sister, my husband, my uncle was grieving. They were very focused only on their grief, and I realized that my dad's reaction was normal. But given that my brother had found, was the one who found my mother in the morning when she was visiting them getting ready for the arrival of my niece, he's been taking it much harder. And I had to have a conversation with my dad to try to find a way to say, um, Dad, I know that you're grieving, but we're in this together. I think it's important that you try to reach out to Mark and ask maybe how he's doing. We're here for you versus saying, why don't you care about us? Because that's how it felt. So on one hand, I felt like I was playing a mother role for my brother, as given the absence of my mom, and then I felt like I was parenting my dad at times, also while grieving as a gay male and having a really young family. My children are 11 months and 4 years old, so I had no other choice but keep me busy as a father. So when my dad did reach out shortly to my brother, he called me right away and said, "Did you talk to Dad?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I did." And he said, "Thank you for that." And I told him what I said. I didn't tell him he was in a hard or a dark spot, but my brother did appreciate that. But regardless of how much I was taking care of my brother, it still didn't seem like it would be enough for him, unfortunately. Now, I just want to talk about some things that helped me, what I was going through. I created videos of mom, of her laughing and dancing with the children. I went and found every live video, every live picture to run them in loops. Some relatives created memory books from the slideshow that was at our funeral and mailed them to me, and that sits on our shelves. And my dad also has one. Um, just so I can pick it up and just sometimes I just hug it just to feel how close she is. Um, Also navigating it. Um, Even with having being a same-sex couple with kids going through school, you're all the time saying to the schools, not like, do you support same-sex couples and families? It's how do you support? And then we also found now all of a sudden that our 4-year-old daughter who's in junior kindergarten is how do you support our daughter's going through grief, but also as a same-sex couple going through grief and challenging those on those issues. In school to ensure that she has the proper support persons and keeping the language as simple as possible was hard because we didn't have a lot of resources. So for an example, um when she was like, well, why can't we call Nan? And that's what she called my mom. It was, well, she doesn't have her, because she didn't have her phone, as you can talk to her, she can't hear you. Or when we got her urn and it was her ashes, we just called it Nanny's angel dust. Um, so there was lots of hurdles of learning, I should say. So just a couple more things before we wrap up. And I know we're getting close. Is I just want to say that it's crucial for employees to find a therapist that understands their unique challenges. For years of me doing counseling, I used to be a paramedic for 17 years. So obviously that comes with a lot of trauma and PTSD. So prevention and those things was more normal for me. I don't do that anymore, thankfully. But I've had a lot of counselors over the years, and when I needed to go back to counseling again, um, I after I can remember speaking to a colleague who said they had a gay counselor and it was way better. I said that's what I'm going to look for. And my new employer allows me to access anybody in Canada anywhere, unlimited. And so I put a search out for an LGBT counselor, it and I've always had a good experience. But I will say, having someone who is much more relatable and has the ability to recommend literature to read, um, able to ask questions some may not be comfortable asking, and I know that as professionals sometimes we are. Sometimes maybe we're hesitant to ask those questions. But if he didn't ask, do you think being gay affected your grief? I don't think I would have ever thought of that and challenged me that way. So I just want to speak to the importance of that for everyone here today. And in grief, doesn't ask who we love, but who we shape, who we grieve. When a gay son loses his mom, he loses a lifetime of both the origin and chosen futures. Let's make sure that any policies and that our presidents catch the fall. And I just want to say one more thing that I've said is as gay men, we grieve in silence. And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take any questions as well.
Thank you so much, Geoff and Mike, for sharing. Mike, your story, I learned a lot from you sharing and putting your heart out there. And I'm so sorry that one of your biggest supporters is now not physically present anymore. And it's been a difficult time, for you. But I'm happy you found that one support that is an ally. And I think this is why we do this and why we really want to show this is how important it is for us to be allies for people along their grief journey in their different ways. And so we do have some time, a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask, you can raise your hand, and we can put in the chat. If not, so I don't see any hands. So a lot of thank yous coming up. I think you said your words impacted people's hearts, and I think that's where change happens. Okay, we have hand up, Emelissa.
Hi, I just want to thank you guys so much for doing this. Mike, your story, um, really resonated with me. I'm currently on a research team doing a project about narratives of grief of LGBTQ people, where we ask that question, how do you think being an LGBTQ member of community has affected your grief, has affected your grieving, has affected your story? So yeah, I don't know if I can put a shameless plug in somewhere for that because we are still openly recruiting, and getting this kind of information is really important, I think, for helping, as well as I think we have a lot to learn, as you said today, from like the resilience of the LGBTQ community.
Thank you.
And that's great. You're doing that research. I would love to, in the center, would love to sort of read your findings when you have that finished too. Okay, I think if you have any more questions or comments, I think we'll wrap up. So thank you again, Geoff and Mike, for just being here today, sharing your personal experience and just also your own knowledge of what you've learned along the way. And it's helping all of us just, be better allies and understand, the impact of the past. It's not just about the grief that's going on in the moment. It's about our whole life that we're bringing to the table and how important these people are to us. And as we find our identity. And so before, sometimes we have a poll. I don't think we did in the beginning, so I'm going to skip that. So I hope everyone else here enjoyed the session. And when you close the Zoom, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. We always love hearing your thoughts on it. And so the registration for the next session is called Grief and Loss Along the Dementia Journey, and that's scheduled for May 28th at 12 p.m. Pacific time. And so to be notified of any other sessions that we have in the series, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And the aim is to provide a recording of this and session summary notes and any other resources that were talked about today within the next 7 working days. So you get an email for that. And so once again, thank you both for being here. If you also have any other resources you want to share with anyone that you may find helpful, Geoff and Mike, please let us know and we'll put those into the notes that we're going to give everyone.